London, University of Graz, and Passau University. Her research interests include the acquisition and loss of citizenship, new mobilities, Europeanization, and state building. She is the author of the book Global Market for Investor Citizenship, published last year. Then we'll have Damir Kapidžić, who is an assistant professor of comparative politics at the University of Sarajevo in Bosnia and Herzegovina. His research looks at ethnic conflict, political parties, and power sharing, as well as process through which democratic or authoritarian politics are institutionalized. He is the editor of the recent special issue, Illiberal Politics in Southeastern Europe, in the Journal of Southeast European and Black Sea Studies. And then finally, we have Dario Čepo, who is an assistant professor at University of Zagreb's Faculty of Law. He holds a PhD degree in comparative politics from the University of Zagreb's Faculty of Political Science. He was a Fulbright Scholar at Columbia University from 2013 to 2014. And his major research interests are parliaments, conservative movements, and the European Union. He is author of numerous articles, a handbook, Introduction to Political Science, co-authored with Slaven Ravlić, and as well as the book, Political Institutions of the European Union, published in 2013. Well, now I would like to turn the floor to the panelists, and we'll begin with 10-minute presentations from each, beginning with Jelena, please.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Mila for organizing and moderating this panel, but also the entire ASN team that's bringing us closer to the annual meeting, which I guess all of us will very much miss this year at Columbia University in New York. I'm very happy that despite the circumstances that we are all in, that we are able to exchange our ideas in the online space, at least. So as you know, the topic of today's panel is the democratic backsliding in the Western Balkans. And this is a sort of a reality that's not new to the region. It's a process that has been ongoing for the last at least 10 to 12 years. So my argument today is that this backsliding is the outcome of two mutually reinforcing processes. The first one are the uncertain and stalled European integration process, which is a sort of exogenous to the region, but also the internal or endogenous processes, such as the state capture that's happening in most of the Western Balkan states. Now, obviously, seen as a general rule, both of these processes are very complex. So what I'll try and do in the next couple of minutes, and I'll try to be brief, I promise, is to try and unpack the main features of these two processes, and I can leave the details for the discussion that will happen after the presentation. I hope to give you a bit of an ending with highlights of the effects of COVID-19 on the present day reality that the Western Balkan countries are facing. So as I mentioned, the first reason or the first dynamic that has contributed to the democratic backsliding in the Western Balkans is the so-called unfulfilled magic of Europe. Early in the 2000s, there was a promise of democracy across the entire region, and you know what happened during those times. And this promise of democracy was accompanied and reinforced by the 2003 Thessalonica Agenda, which reaffirmed the political commitment of the European Union to the future of the region within the EU. Now, in the Western Balkan states, at least initially, this was taken as a sort of an incentive to try and build a stable and a more prosperous future. Yet, contrary to these initial hopes, the process itself failed to deliver. And it failed to deliver in most aspects, and it failed to produce credible outcomes. And this is obviously in part due to the unconsolidated nature of the Western Balkan states, but also to the initial lack of understanding of the European Union, that the approach that had previously worked in the case of Central and East European countries, that it needed to be adapted to the specificities of the Western Balkans, and that it would not have the same effects a decade later and in a completely different context. Now, the examples are many, but some would include the impossibility to change the constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina after the Sejdić and Finci judgment of the ECTHR, the 15-year limbo in North Macedonia over the name issue, or also the general rule of law issues that were in a way overlooked for the sake of stability. And this is something that Florian Bieber and Marko Kmezić and a lot of people have worked on. So essentially the fact that the European Union prioritized stability over change in a way. Now, with this in mind, and this is something that I was thinking about when I was trying to prepare the presentation today, I was thinking about Aristotle's saying that nature abhors a vacuum. And essentially, this means that things need to move perpetually. And even if they stop moving, if they move in different directions. So once the Western Balkans stopped, or rather slowed down their hopes of accession, due to obviously the bleak prospects for entering the EU, no clear timelines of accession, poor incentives, or if you wish, the failure of EU conditionality. Once this all happened, they started moving in the opposite direction. And this is what marked the democratic backsliding in the region. Well, obviously, in addition to these exogenous factors, the democratic backsliding of the region was, and still is, reinforced by captured states. Now, state capture, and this is something that I worked on together with Soren Kyle, has been enabled by protracted transition, but also by the lack of A, democratic political culture, and B, the lack of good governance. And these factors essentially combined into dominance of political elites over the key institutions of the state. And I think two aspects where this is most visible is one, the capture of public administration. Now, in most of the Western Balkan states, political elites have installed party cadre in the top positions of public administration. Now, on top of influencing the functioning of state institutions, this also facilitated the capture of the various states' economies. And here the most obvious examples are public procurement procedures, and especially during process of privatization, but also with the franchising of the different services of the states. And this economic capture has essentially brought about the rise of economic oligarchies, which are very closely connected to the different political elites in the Western Balkans. Now, if you think about this situation, well, coupled by the background, coupled by the context in which internal divisions over ethnicity, over nation, over identity, religion, but also territories, could have had no beneficial effects on democracy. And these internal, in a way, dynamics have also contributed to the backsliding of democracy in the Western Balkans. Now, just because I think I'm slowly running out of time, I'm going to move towards the current situation. And we can see in the COVID-19 world that the current events have increased the visibility of many of these issues. So first of all, you can see that the external dimension that contributed to the backsliding of democracy is hardly to get any better in the near future. The European Union has will have to, in a way, focus on itself, because it has quite a lot of internal challenges that have been brought about not only by COVID-19, but also by the exit of the United Kingdom from the European Union. But also there will be most certain recession that will ensue after this period. So it's highly unlikely that the European perspective of the Western Balkans is going to get any better in the near future. Secondly, COVID-19 and the events surrounding it have reinforced the regulatory capacity of the state. And we can see this in the international travel bans, border closures, but also internal movement restrictions, such as lockdowns and curfews. So in a way, as much as I would like to end this talk on a positive note, I would say that essentially the effects of COVID-19 on the Western Balkans will essentially further democratic backsliding in the region. But I think that these are dynamics that will not be an idiosyncrasy of the Western Balkans, because right now in quite a lot of parts of the world, we can see how democracy is essentially being challenged at many levels. So I will leave it at that, and I'm very happy to take your questions on board in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Jelena. And now we'll turn to our second presenter, Damir Kapidžić.
Thank you very much, Mila. And first of all, so thank you again for bringing all of this together. It is an opportunity to come together and discuss these issues that are important, even though we are in 4 different places right now. So what I'm going to talk about is basically built on the contributions to the special issue that I edited that came out recently. The virtual issue was in January and the print issue was about a month ago. And it talks about this concept of illiberal politics that we introduced in order to try and operationalize what it is that democratic backsliding means in the Western Balkans. So when we talk about these concepts, we usually rely on Nancy Bermeo's democratic backsliding as a general concept of a process where democratic institutions are eroded from within. And then we sort of, if you try and figure out where it leads to, you move to this competitive authoritarianism concept by Levitsky and Way. So it's sort of a step-by-step approach. And we're trying to trace these steps that are happening in the Balkans. So what we're basically talking about is that no country in the Balkans in general has experienced drastic democratic reversal. There has been no abolishment of democracy or an authoritarian system put in place instead of it. But what we have instead is a gradual decline, what we call a slow motion decline, of incrementally moving away from democracy and towards an authoritarian system. And this is evident not just in one of these countries, but throughout the whole region. There are different dynamics, different timelines on which this happens, but it's essentially happening in all countries in some way or form. Now, what we did basically was to look within this. So what democratic institutions are being eroded? And in this sense, we distinguish between institutions of electoral democracy and so-called liberal institutions or institutions of liberal constitutionalism. So guarantees for rights, checks and balances, independent oversight, and so on and so forth. And the basics that we found out is that electoral democracy as such is not specifically eroded. It's not backsliding to the extent that other more liberal guarantees of checks and balances are. So what we see is that we have very strong shortcomings in this liberal component of democracy that is basically situated in constitutional liberalism. So these are press freedoms, for example. This is independence of judiciary. This is oversight capacity of legislative bodies. And then again, going into this a bit more detail, also the redistributive rights So for example, through public procurement issues and so on. What we did is that we took a look at various democracy indices. We basically focused on the more contemporary VDEM index, the Varieties of Democracy Index, and tracing it throughout, because it does have these two components separately. We can trace them individually side by side for all of these countries. And what we basically found out when we tried to track the change is that all countries are backsliding to some extent, or at least stagnating and not moving forward in any meaningful way. And this is most evident in Serbia through the past 6-7 years. You can also see increased backsliding in, it's backsliding or autocratization. You can also use that term for it, which the authors of VDEM use, in Montenegro, where you have increased autocratization in the past few years. Croatia has experienced a very specific form of backsliding, where some elements are even strengthened. So electoral democracy is pretty good still, but other components such as freedom of press are really just falling through the floor. And then you have countries which are sort of a bit tricky to figure out, and Bosnia is one of them, and I'll talk about this in a few minutes. But also countries such as Albania and Kosovo are more stagnating in a sense that starting off from a very low threshold, they're improving on some issues, but at the same time, they're backsliding on other issues. So it's a complex picture where basically all of the countries in the region are becoming more similar, again, in terms of the weaknesses of democracy that they exhibit. Why is this the case? That was basically what we were trying to answer. And this is where we come up with a sort of view on a few structural issues that we have. And this is basically the process of democratization that happened during the early 1990s. We rely on this on Zakršek and Dolenec, who try and identify these so-called power mutations. And these can be found throughout Eastern Europe to various forms, where you have a power concentration in the executive rather than a balance between executive and legislature, where you have a power conversion of political power to economic power, basically meaning a redistribution of economic assets or access to resources based on political affiliation. And finally, you have a power dispersion. This is very specific to the Balkans, where informality plays a huge role, and where party structures are basically the agents that are able to access power and that able to redistribute it. All of this comes together through, let's say, botched democratization or a stalled democratization that was not brought to an end in the early 2000s. I would say was cut short by the economic crisis of 2008, where basically at a time when you should have invested double to try and secure democracy throughout the region, most democracy promotion just simply pulled out. In a sense, what we have is that each country has this distinct set of democratic weaknesses and flaws that contribute to these more or less common patterns of de-democratization. And finally, to conclude a little bit about what's so special about Bosnia, again, it is one of the most complex institutional structures that we have in the world. And one of the elements that we have is, well, it's based on co-associational democracy, but it's based on two elements, one element of power sharing, but also territorial autonomy and a very weak national level of politics. So when we talk about democratic backsliding in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we're not so much talking about backsliding at the national level. We're more or less talking about backsliding at the subnational levels that have most access to resources, that are most capable of controlling both media, judiciary, and so on. So these are the levels that are backsliding. And here you can see an asymmetry. One part of the country, the Republika Srpska, is basically in free fall. So you have a violation of association rights, you have explicit control of state, of public media, of public broadcast. You have a lot of things that are basically contributing to it can actually almost be labeled a competitive authoritarian regime. On the other hand, in the second part of the country, the so-called Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, you have much more checks and balances that are institutionalized. And while it may not be effective as Republika Srpska in managing policies, it's also not effective in autocratizing the whole country itself. So basically what you can see, and this is sort of this contribution to power sharing theory that we found out in this, is where you have ethnic contest, you can try and contain autocratization to contain it in your own part of the state, so that you can rule as an autocrat and not really care about the whole broader context. So you contain your policies in order to govern your own part of the country. And this is also, you can see it in other contexts as well, and we can discuss this in the Q&A. And the second is that you can constrain autocrats through power sharing arrangements, where you have explicit power sharing in institutions, where you have institutionalized checks and balances through consociationalism, for example. Autocratic tendencies can be constrained. This is not perfect, and it usually leads to gridlock in terms of making executive decisions, but it is a damper. It does not allow for so decisive and quick action across the board. So you do have this element that you can use in that sense. Again, we find the same structural issues that caused democratic backsliding throughout the Balkans, also present in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So weak institutions, a huge influence of informality and party structures. But we also find elements where you have agent motivations, especially fear of protests, and fear of protests from one's own group. So it's not fear of protests from another ethnic group that you're really afraid of, but if your own people start to protest against yourself, this is where you can double down on autocratic politics, or liberal politics as we call them. And this is what you can see in Republika Srpska today. So I'll stop here, and I hope that we can continue the discussion further during the Q&A session. So Mila, back to you.
Thank you very much, Damir, for an excellent presentation, and also within the time that was allotted. So far, we are on time, on schedule. I will turn next to Dario. Thank you.
Thank you, Mila. This puts a lot of pressure on me to stick to the time as well. Thank you all for joining us. Because Croatia has been called the success story of the Western Balkans, my presentation should be optimistic. Unfortunately, if any of you who's listening now or watching now knows there's no chance in hell I'm going to be optimistic at all. So this one's going to start optimistically, and then it will just spiral to a complete pessimism by the end. So you have something to look forward to, I guess. As I said, I mean, Croatia somehow doesn't fit into this narrative, right? You have Montenegro, a country that is currently going through the accession process. You have Bosnia and Herzegovina, a country currently waiting to start the negotiation process. And then you all of a sudden have Croatia, 7-year member of the European Union already, having a presidency of the Council of the European Union currently. And it seems it's somehow not comparable. Unfortunately, I think you will see by the end that it's completely comparable, and that it is somewhat of a, look into the future for the countries of the Western Balkans. So despite being called a success story, Croatia's accession to the European Union really didn't bring a full flourishing of the democracy. Just the opposite. Since 2015, we see through VDEM and through Bertelsmann Index and some other indices, we see slow but persistent backsliding in almost all of the liberal elements or liberal variables of the liberal democratic nexus. So my question when I started doing this research was to ask myself why. So if we were expecting to become better or more democratic with the membership, and if the membership was linked to us, to Croatia, fulfilling all the obligations and becoming democratic in the process, how come we see the backsliding now? And through my analysis, I pinpointed the answer in two main elements. The first one is the dominance of the main political party, or the dominant political party, Croatian Democratic Union, center-right to national right party, depending how you see it, and who is in power, and that party being helped by or that party belonging to currently dominant political family in the European Union, European People's Party, which is the main European level instigator or catalyst of the democratic backsliding in Central and Eastern Europe. So these two elements allowed Croatian Democratic Unions, after it came to power in 2015, to backslide on almost all elements of the liberal part of the liberal democratic nexus, either through capture of the institution, through the control of the institution by their cadres or sycophants, as Jelena already mentioned, by marginalization of some institution which they couldn't capture, and weakening of some through reforms in legislature as well, if they couldn't capture it. So when I'm speaking about these institutions, I dominantly think about and mean the judiciary, which Damir already mentioned, which is completely, I would say, the most crucial institution that is allowing for the current political elites to control the political system in every country of the Western Balkans, including Croatia. The media, especially the public broadcaster, and the third one is independent and control agencies, right, which were supposed to be this upper layer of control over the political system. In my paper, which is published in the special issue that Damir mentioned already, I give some examples of the capturing and the marginalization of these institutions. I specifically talk about the public broadcaster, the National Foundation for the Development of Civil Society, which is siphoning money from mainstream, long-established civil society organizations to completely new astroturf institutions and organizations that are there to placate what the government is saying and to be somewhat of a fig leaf to what government is doing. And I'm talking especially about the National Judiciary Council, which is one of the strongest gatekeepers of the reform of judiciary that is highly needed in order to safeguard the democratic elements of the democratic system in Croatia. This capturing, marginalization, and control is also helped by the lack of external pressures, which we saw and which were present during the 2000s before Croatia became the member of the European Union. But also they are coming through internal pressures as well, because there are certain veto players that Croatian Democratic Union highly depends on and needs to placate in order for them to maintain power. Those are, and I also mentioned them in the paper, the Catholic Church, the veterans organizations from the 1990s war, and the conservative civil society organizations, which are importing the conservative agenda already highly visible in the Western European countries and especially in the United States of America. Just to conclude briefly, because I'm running out of time, why I'm saying that I'm pessimistic is that one of the elements, so during these 2000s, two main elements maintained the democratic stability of the democratic system of Croatia. One of them being the external in the guise of the EU, and the other one being the power sharing, internal power sharing between or cohabitation, if you want to call it, between the president and the parliament and the government. So now in the future, there is no more external pressure. The EU, as we can see in the last couple of years, can't do absolutely anything to the worst offenders, Hungary, Poland, etc., let alone those that are, just flying under the radar, like Croatia is, or like Malta is, or some others. So there's only an internal pressure for the democratic stabilization or stopping of the democratic backsliding, which is power sharing. So splitting the executive, the presidency, and the government in such a way that HDZ, Croatian Democratic Union, can't really monopolize all the institutions of power. Once it does it, its internal nature, the one of controlling autocratically and trying to maintain the dominance, comes out and brings forth the democratic backsliding in such a force that civil society organizations, media, and judiciary can't really cope. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop here and looking forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Jelena. Thank you, Dario and Damir, for staying brief, and also for very, very insightful presentations that already started to generate some questions from the audience. And because of the interest of time, and because I have seen several connections between your presentations, I would like to maybe group the questions in this way as well. And what is really wonderful about this set of presentations is that we see the processes of democratic development or backsliding at 3 different levels. Across these cases, we see it at the international level, in terms of relations of the countries to EU. We see it at the national level in terms of national institutions, but also legacies of the past, as well as other national level factors. And then, of course, we see for me, I'm a little biased here, internal contestation forces within each country, and that is really where I think democracy really, some of the lessons could be mostly applied in other countries. Well, they are specific to these countries, but there are certain dynamics that may be parallel. So let me begin then, and I will try to cover all of your questions in these different processes, but there were 2 questions from the Q&A that had to deal with the internal contestation, and I would like to pose them, and whoever feels the most qualified can respond. Well, the first question was about the resistance by opposition forces in form of boycotting of either democratic institutions, electoral institutions. The question was, is this an effective strategy, and what is its impact on democracy? That's the first question with internal contestation. The second question is specifically, and again, here we can use cases of different countries. The second question I think is interesting. Montenegro case kind of is also an example of internal contestation in terms of this. The question was, is the reconciliation between the pro-European and anti-European forces possible or feasible? So I'll turn it to you, and you can answer in order you wish, or whoever wishes to.
You do it, Jelena.
Okay. Well, I was hoping to avoid the discussion about Montenegro today because, anyways, I'm trying to not be whatever you don't know about Montenegro, whatever you've never known about Montenegro, never dare to ask. So just to go back to the 2 questions regarding internal contestation, and I'll link them to the example of Montenegro. One is the example of the opposition boycotts whether they had an impact on democracy or whether they were a successful pressure on the incumbents. Now, if you look at it, the resistances of opposition in the form of boycott are very much unhealthy for the state of democracy in the region. And the Montenegrin example could show you how the lack of opposition and their perpetual boycott has essentially amplified the power of the ruling elite. So I think that in this sense, we can see that a healthy democratic dialogue, polylogue, essentially requires all participants to take place. Also, in a way, the boycott of opposition, it might be a symbolic gesture on the one hand, but it's also, in a way, it's also not giving back to the public who pays taxes and thus the salaries of all those people who are boycotting their work in parliament and in some countries even for years. So in a way, I don't think that this contributes to an open democratic dialogue, although it could be a powerful symbolic statement. Now, the second question was funnily enough, publicly proclaimed very pronounced pro-European stance of the Montenegrin government, as opposed to its corrupt practices. And in a way, I don't see the two as incompatible because the first one is only a rhetoric. So in a way, I think that this pro-European stance, the pro-European discourse, is virtually used to cover all the undemocratic practices under the cloud. Okay, we're pro-European, we're working to bring in this country closer to the European Union. People may or may not believe in it, but in a way, it's a sort of a smokescreen for everything that's happening in the background. So one is a discourse, the other one is a practice. And in this sense, they are not incompatible, and very likely the pro-European discourse reinforces corruption because it essentially obfuscates everything else that's problematic with the governance in the country. So I think I'll leave it at that and pass the floor to someone else.
Let me jump in and add a couple of more questions that fit in the internal, since we are talking about internal, and Jelena, you don't have to address, we'll leave this for Damir and Dario. So the question was to comment a little bit about the conservative civil society in Croatia. I think it also fits within this theme, and also the role in general of civil society in all Balkan countries vis-a-vis different forces that might be more progressive or more conservative and so on, in terms of their role in democracy, democratic either backsliding or consolidation.
Thank you for this question. I think the role of the civil society is very important, needs to be addressed, and especially the role of the conservative civil society organizations, because they are newly formed, or they are just new in the region. I would say, at least in Croatia, I can't really talk about, maybe the situation is different in other countries. Although the ideas behind them and the individuals who are main connective tissues or networkers of the conservative civil society organization or conservative movement have been present here for decades, the power that the conservative civil society started to exhibit started only since, I would say, 2010, right, 2010. It was helped by the great economic crisis, or the financial crisis, which engulfed Croatia and really destroyed its GDP for several years to come. And it was also helped by Croatian Democratic Union, the main dominant party, being in the opposition at that time, and the ruling Social Democrats not really being able to fight off all the problems and or all the issues that were plaguing the economic and the political and the social or societal system in Croatia. So these conservative civil society organizations jumped into some kind of a void or a vacuum and started talking about these identity politics, identity policies, cultural topics, which were, in their own view, going too much in a too much of a progressive way, helped by apparently social democratic government, which is completely and utterly ridiculous. And then their voice is being amplified by the opposition Croatian Democratic Union at that moment, which used the conservative civil society in order to destabilize the system. And then the issue, and this is where the European Union comes in, right? Croatia had an obligation to hold a referendum in order for the country to accede into the European Union. The legal norms regarding the referendum were really strict. So you had to have more than half of the population getting out to vote, and then getting more than half of that number, right? So almost everybody, due to the lackluster nature of Croatian Euro or pronounced Euroscepticism in the Croatian society, the government feared that the referendum will fail and that the accession will not be able to go through. So they abolished the 30%, the 50% threshold for the constitutional referendums to become viable or obligatory. Right? But what they didn't do, or what they did in that speed, is forgetting to put any threshold for the referendum to be valid. Right? So the conservative social civil society organizations, especially those anti-LGBT and anti-abortion and pro-church or pro-religion, jumped on that wagon, used the lack of any threshold, and pushed through the anti-LGBT agenda. This allowed them to become to mainstream them into the civil society and into the society at large, and to give them enough of a power to become a veto player, which could then force Croatian Democratic Union, once they came back to power, to, for example, stop the education reform or fire the children's ombudsman, which wasn't up to their, or ombudsperson, which wasn't up to their liking, etc. So this idea, and I think, I mean, I'm talking about a very special example, Croatian conservative civil society organizations. But what is it, I think, interesting for the broader audience here is that these organizations imported their ideas from the United States of America mostly, which are now also seen in, for example, anti-Black Lives Matter protests, etc., etc. I'm going to stop here. Sorry, I'm talking too much.
Damir, before you begin, there was just a couple of questions that came to you. So in addition to answering the questions previously posed, could you also reply, add some external factors to this and say why or what was the effect of external democracy program after 2008, 2009? That was a specific question. There was another question for you regarding illiberal trends in the Balkans. You mentioned the illiberal trends, which is not unique to the region, but share with CEE. How does it go in line with what is argued by Zakaria in his seminal article, and what goes on in Hungary and Poland? So if you can kind of combine all of those as you answer and be brief, again, we have to keep in mind.
I will try to be as brief as possible, but you know how that works, and I will be brief. So John Gold asked about the retreat of democracy promotion post 2008 financial crisis. What you did see was not so much well, you did see a retreat on the one hand from international actors, but you also saw a shift of focus, and that was much more relevant. In terms of not trying to promote a democracy in countries in your periphery, which the Balkans actually are towards Europe, but trying to focus within oneself and address problems created by the financial crisis and the sovereign debt crisis. All of this, and then you can just simply add all of the European crises that followed, Euro crisis, migrant crisis, Corona right now, Brexit, and all of this contributed to the shift away from an external environment more to solving problems within. And what we see that the trigger was in 2008, that was a starting point. It was not so much the end point, but you have all of this that followed after that. I have the question sorry, I'll butcher your name, David Matsa Berige, on the way that this works about the liberal trends. Yes, it very much builds on this seminal both work by Zakaria, but also on all of the work that followed it in trying to identify processes that lead to illiberal democracy. What Zakaria tried to do there, and what most that followed him did, is try to classify regimes. This is not what we're trying to do here. We're not trying to create a classification, what's illiberal democracy, what's competitive authoritarianism, but we're trying to create a procedural approach, trying to look at how. So not the what, but the how. You could think of it that you have a disease and the outcome of that disease is illiberal democracy or competitive authoritarianism, but you also need to figure out all of the ways to address this disease. And you don't figure that out just by knowing what you have. You have to try and figure out what mechanisms it causes and how it affects the body. Right now when we're talking about the pandemic. And this is what illiberal politics is. It looks at the individual acts taken by parties in government with the intention to remain in government. So be it through control of media, be it through control of judiciary. That's basically what we build on, this procedural approach. I also have an interesting question here that I myself highlighted by Paula Pickering about civil society and the role that civil society plays in this backsliding. And you can see it basically on the example of Macedonia, where you have civil society as a reversal of democratic backsliding. It is able to halt backsliding at one point and reverse it, or at least try to reverse it in a way. You also have the flip side of that, where you have social movements, such as in Macedonia. This can mostly be taken as a way to either halt or reverse backsliding. But there's a lot of what we say gongos, government-organized NGOs in the Balkans, and these actually help backsliding. So you can see that especially in Serbia through government-organized protests brought together by various gongos showing up with thousands of people showing up to protest on an issue that the government actually is championing. So that's where civil society, and again, this is how you define civil society. So how autonomous is a civil society in the Balkans, where you don't have this American style of funding civil society from the ground up. It's much more top-down funded. And this is why I say social movements, definitely, yes, they can affect democratic backsliding in a way that they halt it, but organized civil society in terms of NGOs, not so much. They don't really have that effect. So I'll give it back to you now.
Okay, so there are quite a few questions, so I'm gonna still stick to my original division into internal, external, and other factors. But I also, in terms of national and cross-national comparisons, I would like us to also consider that, because I realize from the questions that we have a lot of members of the audience who are interested in comparisons. Also, I would like to bring a question that doesn't fit into my categories, and that's about concepts. And I think it's important because we just used the concepts and we didn't necessarily clarify what we mean by backsliding, what we mean by state capture, and so on. That was a question earlier in the discussion. So if you could address that in the next round of answers. But also, there were questions about comparisons in terms of to what extent is this valuable to some of the other cases like Turkey, Poland, Hungary. Kosovo was mentioned. We didn't talk about Kosovo specifically yet. Serbia, we didn't talk a lot about, but certainly it came in questions as well. in the region and outside of the region, therefore. And also, in terms of comparisons, to what extent is there some type of there was a question of worldwide erosion of democracy because of corruption or because of rise of nationalism? And then another related question, one of the last ones in Q&A, is about the disillusionment with the progressive forces. To what extent are some of these forces may be comparable with other cases? We can turn again to Jelena and then go to Dario and then Damir. So everybody gets a chance to say, and please keep the answers as brief as possible. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to Mila and to everyone who posed these really important and challenging questions. I'll try and pick and address some of them, so please bear with me. And I'll try and do it in a way that goes through by addressing several aspects of what she just mentioned. Now, if we go back to Dario's presentation, and I thought it was fascinating because he spoke about why Croatia's accession to the EU never brought about this flourishing of democracy. And this is something that made me think about countries in Central and Eastern Europe, because also there we can see that in a way, the European Union accession was a sort of an unfulfilled hope of a better life, hope of greater democratic standards, etc., etc. And I think we don't have to go further than Hungary and Poland to see the issues that have occurred in these countries in this domain. Now, when we come to questions which, if I'm not mistaken, David Kanan posed related to the terminology, and also to link it to Tena's question on the disillusionment with the progressive forces. Now, speaking about what backsliding means, it's not necessarily that there has been a stable state of institutional or societal democracy. Democracy in itself is a sort of both discursive and institutional ideal. What we could see in the early 2000s was in a way a movement towards establishing different democratic practices in countries that for decades and decades had scarcely any. Now, in this sense, backsliding was, and this is where David is right, this is detaching from the democratic practices that have been co-opted during this initial push in a democratic direction in the early 2000s. Now, there is also the question of the external enablers in the sense of the global backsliding of democracy. And I think that this global pattern in which there are not many, so to say, good examples, and where countries or political elites in these countries don't have, when political elites in countries that already have good governance issues see that, let's say, their counterparts in other parts of the world can do away with certain things, I think that they replicate those patterns rather than patterns of good governance. Now, state capture, in the sense that I use it and also in some of my writings, essentially refers to dominance of political elites over the institutional framework of states, in this case of the Western Balkan states. I also wanted to briefly respond to a very interesting question about the the influences, obviously, of Russia, but also we can see the influences of China in the region and how they're related to democratic backsliding. And I think that in many cases, we can see the impact of the emerging elites, so emerging oligarchies from these countries that essentially influence the, let's say, already established elites in the Western Balkan states. And in a way, they reinforce, and I would say in particular, the economic aspects of state capture. And this was related also to the question on the lack of understanding of the EU that I mentioned as terminology. And sorry, because I've just forgotten to respond to this. When I mentioned the lack of understanding of the EU on what the process of EU accession of the Balkans would look like, I didn't mean it in the sense of a normative agenda, because I don't think that the substance of the EU's normative agenda has changed. The practical aspects of it, the acquis is there, and there are, let's say, parts of the acquis that have evolved, but they have evolved independently of what's been happening in the Western Balkans. So this is not something that that I was referring to, but rather the perhaps the inadequate understanding that enlargement and transformation of the Western Balkan region is not one size fits all process. So it's these countries can't all fit into the same shoe. So the process essentially needed to be differentiated, actually first different from the process that took place a decade ago in the Central and East European, decade and a half ago in Central and East European states, but also differentiated because of the specificities. And these specificities needed perhaps a modified approach. So I think I'll leave it at this, and we can perhaps continue this in the next round.
Okay, I'll just jump in right ahead. I'll try and tag along on what Jelena already said. She said quite a lot of what I was thinking as well, and I'm glad that she allowed me to say even more. And I'll try to answer both Tena Prelec and David Matsaberidze's questions regarding the endogenous factors and the domestic actors and the disillusionment by the citizens in the entire endeavor that is called European integration. And I think it is linked, although it is called European integration, it is actually linked to the development of the democratic system or the maintenance of the democratic system. Hence, it is absolutely important both for the case of Turkey or for the case of the United States of America or for any other part of the world, because it is basically our understanding, us as citizens, of how our democratic system, or how our political system how democratic it should be, and what do the political elites do. Absolutely, Tena is right. Disillusionment by the citizens in the political elites that were pushing for the European integration was one of the main factors of backsliding, not in a sense that citizens became jaded by democracy, which they did, but in the sense that once the attacks on the democratic institutions started, the citizens didn't find it in their hearts or in their whatever minds as important to go out on the street, to protest, to ask their representatives, to stop the marginalization or the capture of the institutions. And once there is no such pressure by the citizens, the bottom-up pressure by the citizens, there is almost no chance in any political system, even the highly developed one like the United Kingdom or United States, let alone a completely autarkic one and parochial ones like in the Western Balkans, for the political elites to do it themselves. What they are interested in is maintaining the grip on power, because the grip on power allows them to exploit financial and financial interests from the public coffers, right? And this is also then linked to the idea that in the citizens' minds that the European Union, once we become members, will help through their institutions, because our institutions are bad, but European institutions are good, and the European institutions will stop the you know, local warlords or the local you know, whatever lords to extract public funds. And then once they saw that European Commission or the Council of the European Union doesn't do anything, right? And that the agencies are weak in a sense that they are under the influence of the governments, then this disillusionment already started. And this is the main culprit for this, is, in my opinion, and in some senses, I'm trying to analyze some other elements, is the European People's Party. Their interests, like the Republican Party in the United States or the Conservative Party in United Kingdom, is to maintain the power in the member states and in the Brussels institutions. And if that means putting up with Viktor Orban, or putting up with Croatian Democratic Union, or putting up with somebody else somewhere else, then it's completely okay, unless the situation just becomes unmanageable. This didn't happen. So European People's Party and Croatian Democratic Union, to answer David's question, as a member of European People's Party, will absolutely have no qualms in going the illiberal way, if this illiberal way means maintaining the grip on power in member states' capitals. You can see it absolutely clearly in the case of Hungary, which is absolutely cannot be called a democracy. And red lines after red lines of European People's Party has been crossed, and they just keep ignoring. So in this sense, it is not the national elites and national actors that are destroying or doing the backsliding on their own. It is absolutely with the help of some European Union actors and institutions, EPP, the top. Thank you.
Okay, and I'll just continue on from there. I mean, yes, this is part of a more global trend that we can see, that we have democratic decline now also empirically verified in many countries, including the United States. And this is something that is a global trend. But I think that what is important here is to disaggregate our notion of democracy, not to take it as a singular notion in itself, because not all elements of democracy are in decline, to put it that way. And this is where you look at these single elements, and especially, for example, when you talk about independent institutions and freedom of press, those are in serious danger. While elections as such are only secondary. In some cases, they're not even, they're not something that is declining as such, at least not as rapidly. And here you can also draw a lot of comparison to other countries. You can draw a comparison to Hungary. You can draw a comparison to Turkey. You can draw a comparison. Russia is a bit far-fetched, but maybe even in that case, where you have electoral institutions still in place. In Hungary, the ruling party can lose mayoral elections. The same goes for Turkey. And this is where we see that electoral institutions per se are not being targeted to that extent. It's this need for one form of legitimacy, this democratic form of legitimacy that the ruling party does not want to infringe on. So they think that this is something that they should not touch. And I mean, this is a good thing, I would say. Elections have slowly become an untouchable affair. You cannot tamper with elections, at least not blatantly. You cannot stuff the ballots. But what you can do is, and this is what Levitsky and Vey say, you can make an uneven playing field. So you can imagine a hill, and the team that has to play uphill has a much harder battle to get their ball across the finish line. And this is something that you can see throughout. So when media covers the ruling party for 20 minutes and gives 2 minutes to the opposition, that's something that you can, I mean, it does not create an even playing field. And this is something that you have in Serbia, you have it in Turkey, in Russia, in Hungary, in Montenegro, in Bosnia. You could just simply keep on counting. It's what the United States is slowly turning into, unfortunately, where the governing party tries to monopolize all sorts of communications through media. If you don't report nice about me, I will not talk to you at all. So in this sense, this type of democratic decline, I think it's something that is developing and something that we need to track. And in this sense, it's also an opportunity for comparative politics to try and look at these various contexts, because while they are different, they have a simple or singular way of addressing democracy. Now, about solutions to this, and this is sort of the backside of it, and a few of the comments also mentioned it. Yes, protests are a solution and social movements are a solution to trying to reverse this. But if they do not build on strong and independent institutions that they can put in check or in place, those protests will not achieve very much. So this is where we can turn to Macedonia as an example, where you did have a change of government, where you did have a change of relationship between the elected leaders and their population. But then again, Macedonia is still experiencing a lot of the same problems that it had under Gruevski, a lot of the informality, a lot of the sort of backroom politics, because the institutions are not there. The institutions are still not developed and not able to handle this independently. So you need both things. You need both to develop strong, independent democratic institutions, a press that's not reliant on government funding, basically, and judiciary that is independent from government. And you need to instill this is what Marko Kmezic and Florian Bieber say, this rule of law, the idea that you should abide by the rules that the law sets out for you. And finally, just related to the Balkans, there was a question about population exodus and how this plays out into this democratic future or non-democratic future. Unfortunately, when we talk about this, it is the most liberal people who are leaving. It is the most educated people who are leaving, and those with the ideas that you can have change. So basically, who gets left behind? The nationalists, the traditionalists, the conservatives. And they're perfectly fine with any form of authoritarian system, or at least semi-authoritarian or competitive authoritarian. And that's something that they don't really care about. Ivan Krasta already talked about this when talking about Bulgaria and Hungary, and you can see it happening in the Balkans as well. So back to you.
Let me just
we have about, yeah, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to quickly jump on the question of migration that Damir mentioned, and to answer Sara Correa's question. It is a two-pronged issue. In one sense, you have immigration in the countries due to the so-called Balkan route and due to the refugees trying to come into Western Balkan countries to go to the Western Europe. So this helps agitate, or this helps the nationalists and the conservative radical reactionaries to pinpoint them as the guilty party who will destroy our way of life, Croatian way of life, which then radicalizes the population against the refugees and the migrants, right? And allows institutions such as police and some parts of the media to become even more radical and in that sense bring the democratic backsliding. But on the other hand, you have emigration from those countries, right? Due to mostly due to financial reasons, but ever more growing is the explanation that people just do not want to live in countries with such highly polarized cultural and identity issues, with so much corruption, with captured political system, etc., etc. So they are leaving because of the democratic backsliding, whereas the excess of immigrants are helping the democratic backsliding, not because of the migrants themselves, but because of the political elites who are using it to, you know, scapegoat basically their own, put on them their own failures. So thanks, Sarah. This was very, very important question.
Okay, so we have only about 10 minutes, 10, 12 minutes left. So I'm so sorry that I can't include all the questions, but I'm glad you did answer the questions on Russia, on refugees, on Exodus. These are some of the questions I had, and China and so on, the influence from the outside. Now, two questions for the closing, and I think I would like them to be a little more, again, turning to concept, but also David Cannon's question about what is actually good governance. Let's think about that within our context. And there was an interesting question about this underside of democracy, the populism being the underside of democracy, something that we see as a trend across the world. So if you could reply to those two, and then we'll close the panel. Thank you.
Let me just finish.
I would like to start with maybe again Jelena,
Sure.
and then Dario, and then Damir. Yeah.
Yes, I will try to be brief. When we speak about good governance, at least in my speech, I normally refer to the indicators, the quantifiable indicators of good governance. Obviously, we can always contest the term in its conceptual meaning, but I guess that there are different measurements when it comes to defining these terms. Now, coming back to populism as the downside of democracy, this is very interesting because, in a way, in quite a number of Western Balkan states, we see populist movements that are fed by states themselves, created, underpinned, and sustained by actually political parties that are in governments in these states. And I guess that emphasizing, and not only in the Western Balkans, because this is something you can see also in the US at the moment, but also in a number of European democracies, whereby ruling political elites use populist politics or elements thereof to, in a way, highlight or emphasize their, let's say, political power base. So just to try and frame it, obviously populism is bad for democracy, but it's also a sort of a side effect or a byproduct of a number of other processes that have essentially allowed populist politics to emerge. And I'll just briefly, because this is very much related to a broader discussion, there was a question on whether intensified EU conditionality in terms of funding and greater membership clarity could kind of reverse the democratic backsliding, or at least entice these countries to move forward and enhance their institutional frameworks, enhance their democracies. My answer to that would be, it depends on whom you are asking. Or essentially, there are scholars, and recently Frank Schimmelfeining and Ulis Edelmeier have published a new article that builds on their earlier external incentives model, where they essentially push forward this idea that in a way, clearer incentive structures could bring about quicker EU accession, quicker Europeanization, or a greater degree of Europeanization in the Balkans. I agree with this, but only in part, because I guess that greater funding in countries that already have strong governance issues in terms of corruption, nepotism, etc., would not have the desired effects if it's not accompanied by very much monitored structural reforms in these countries. But then this brings into question what the EU accession process is all about and to what extent the EU should police the whole process of accession. So I think I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to answer any questions via email or so. Thank you.
I'll just briefly try and answer this good governance as a concept. I guess I'm not going to talk about it theoretically. I'll leave that to Damir if he wishes, because he did do the introductory text. Well, we'll leave it at that. What I think the population, the citizens think. By the way, I'm sorry I keep touching my face. I know it's anti-COVID. It's anti-COVID thing to do, but I guess I'm getting pretty nervous, so that's why I do it. I think. So what I would like to talk is good governance in the sense in which the citizens see. There is a funny kind of proverb going on in the Western Balkan societies, stemming from the wars of the 1990s, which says basically, "I hope you won't see your house on CNN," right? Which means I hope nothing big will happen or dramatic will happen that your life becomes unbearable. So in this sense, I think what citizens or what the general public thinks under the good governance idea is just this parochial sense of situation, the system being in such a good state, Swiss, German, etc., that you really do not think about your politicians. You really do not think about who is sitting in a mayor's office or whatever, and you only think about the state as a provider of goods. When you need municipal garbage disposal carriers or whatever, this is when the state comes in. So good governance is in a sense, in people's mind, in their mind's eye, is me not thinking about state being there at all. And they don't have a good governance now because they constantly need to think about, should I become a member of a ruling party in order for my daughter or my wife or my husband or my brother to become whatever, a janitor in a high school, or get a position in a public administration. This is for them the governance that they are thinking about. And then this democratic backsliding is then helped by the apathy that bad governance brings to the table, and disillusionment that democracy can bring anything else than one ruling elite or political elite coming after another and just doing everything. I know this is not a perfect answer to your question because you wanted the theoretical question, but as Jelena said, we can talk about it more in via emails or in some other situation. Thank you very much for this. This was very fun and amazing.
Let's turn to Damir last to close the answering of the questions, and I think that will be.
Okay. Thank you. So I'll briefly touch on both questions. On good governance, yes, it is possible to develop it, but you need to have it based on institutions, on a stronger institutional framework. And that's something that you could see missing in the Balkans as such. So no matter how well you could develop governance, if you don't have institutions which are independent, non-corruptible, and in a sense function on their own without political guidance, you will not have that much good governance. It's not only the Balkans, by the way. So if we, for example, talk about good governance in terms of elections, again, United States, I'm looking at you. In this sense, good governance is something that you can see being eroded throughout the world. When it comes to electoral institutions in Bosnia, we have opened elections, so they have been scheduled. Now they're having to be rescheduled because of funding issues. In the United States, there's still no plan on how to move forward with elections in November. We're supposed to have ours also in November. It's really going to be something that you need institutions that are capable of doing this independently and that don't rely on political guidance. What Dario mentioned, the Swiss-German model, that's what we sort of idealize as a good governance, institutions, impartiality, and so on and so forth. That's something that's definitely lacking. And this is not by design. I mean, it's mostly on purpose by political leaders who don't see independent institutions as something that can benefit them in any way. And that's why they would rather retain some lever of control, even if this means less good governance. On populism, this is, again, a very weird issue where we have a convergence basically across the globe. We have, because populism is usually us against the elites. That's the basis of populism. We against them, and them being the corrupt elites. In this case, you have the elites who are populist. Against whom? Well, against other elites. And in this sense, who is then the populist? The populist is the person who is in power, who has the most power, using populism as a tool to keep himself or herself in power. It's mostly himself, by the way. So in this sense, when we talk about populism, this new type of populism that we see, these new leaders exemplified from Bolsonaro, Orban, and so on and so forth, this is something that you can see both, again, partially in the United States, but also in the Balkans. And you feel that this is something that is becoming more relevant. And also, just to touch on the question that Pablo Rasmussen said about Russian disinformation campaigns, because this ties into this in a bit. We do have Russian disinformation here, not so much Chinese. They have separate interests, but it's mostly economic. But you do have Russian disinformation, and it's easy to spread, by the way, because Croatia to Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia, we all basically talk the same language. There's mutual understandability between them. You only need to place the information on one channel. It'll get circulated among all of these countries. And you do see these patterns. And we have also research backing this up. So tracking disinformation campaigns, what they call disinformation networks between various online forums, the Serbian Sputnik forum, the Bosnian public TV, for example, is also one of the disinformation hubs, what you could say, the Serb Bosnian TV, the public broadcaster. And this is basically comes down to the question that disinformation or fake information, you can basically get it for free, while for quality information, you have to pay. And if you come up between these two options, you would rather get information for free today, not having to pay for subscriptions and really quality research that's backed up by real life journalists. And again, this plays a lot into the hands of populist leaders, because creating this disinformation, this clout of disinformation, is something that they can utilize in setting themselves apart from those elites, which are, I don't know, in their own world. And I'm the one who talks to you. I'm the one who talks to the people, because they are often also the contents of this disinformation. So it benefits them in a very good way. Yeah, I'll give it back to you. And this was a great panel, by the way. I enjoyed it.
Well, thank you all. What an inspiring and also very informative discussion. Thank you, panelists, for bringing your knowledge and your thoughts, very thoughtful presentations to this very important discussion. And thank you all our audience attendees for your wonderful questions. And we apologize for not addressing all of them. They will be posted on ASN website, all of them, as well as this recording. And feel free to contact us if you have follow-up questions. Thank you again, and be on the lookout for future ASN virtual panels as well. And thanks, and bye, everybody.